Glen, Veal, and I've lived on Guaymas pretty much my whole life, and of course been a neighbor to Cypress. And the reason that I'm here tonight is because on the cruise, it was on September 14th, I had decided that it would be interesting if we had a little information about Cypress as we went around the island. So it precipitated me to dig into some files, and I found some information. So it's not that I've known this information for a long time. This is fairly recent for me, but Tom asked me on the cruise if I would do this, and I said, well, I guess I will. I'm not an expert on the subject, but I'm going to share the information I've learned. And if there's any questions. Oh, okay. That helps a lot because then I can put my papers down.
And let's come on over right about here so they can see the map by behind you.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Thanks. So, anyway, I've always been, known about Cypress as our neighbor to the west, and when I was a kid, we used to go over there. My dad would take us over there, me and about, I think there were 4 friends, there might have been 5 of us, and he would leave us there for a week. But we enjoyed it. We were 13, 14 years old, and we went into the what is now is Eagle Harbor in there, where the boat moorage is, as those of you who were on the cruise saw. But Eagle Harbor is right up here, and we used to go in there. There was my father knew the Foss who was logging at the time, and so he got permission for us to stay there. They weren't logging regularly in the late 50s, but that's where, so I had a lot of good times over there with my friends. We camped on the beach where they had a kind of it was a logging camp of sorts. They had a kind of a main area to eat, and then they had some little cabins for the loggers. But I remember as a kid, they had a launch too that left from Anacortes every morning on a real regular schedule, and you would see it when you were down at the ferry dock going over to Eagle Harbor where they had their camp. That was in the 50s, and I think they logged there in the 40s and 50s, and so Foss, the way they logged then was that he bought a lot of the island there, the northern end of the island, and then somebody else owned the southern end. So my experience goes back to just camping there, going up to the lake on the top, which is a beautiful lake. I don't know whether we have anything. If you were here at Eagle Harbor, you would hike up this little dotted trail to this lake up here. And we call it Cypress Lake, but I think it's called Phoebe Lake too. So anyway, we would go up there and catch fish and fry them and come back and roll boulders down the cliffs. 1,500 feet high, you could really get some boulders going, so that was good fun when you're 13 years old to launch these boulders. Nobody else was around. No houses. So anyway, I want to just go back to the beginning and just say, well, first of all, that Cypress is 5 miles long, 3 miles wide, and 1,525 feet tall. And it's the 5th largest island in the San Juans, and it's the oldest geological island. I guess that's because of all the outcroppings of rocks. I don't know how to determine that. It's just something I read. The early history is that in July 1791, a fellow named, one of the Spanish explorers named Juan Francisco Eliza, who I'm sure has a name, an island named up here after him, first discovered Cypress, and he named it the Isla San Vicente. And no landings were made. Then in May of 1792, it was discovered again by Lieutenant William Broughton, who was with George Vancouver, and he was his lieutenant. But so I don't know, it never was clear from what I was reading whether he and Vancouver were ever there together, but Lieutenant William Broughton is the one who went ashore. And other things I read, it sounds like Vancouver went ashore, but in this one account it seemed like Broughton did, and he stayed there at Strawberry Bay on the other side over here. Here's Strawberry Bay and there's Strawberry Island. And he went ashore on Strawberry Island and discovered a lot of strawberries, and of course he named it that. And then it sounds like in the end either Vancouver got his notes or Vancouver renamed it from island San Vincent to Cypress because he mistook the junipers that are growing over there for cypress trees, and so that's how it's renamed Cypress. Getting a little ahead of myself here, there was an effort in the early 1900s, not much of an effort, but it was apparently in an editorial in the Anacortes American about they wanted to rename it Rhododendron Island because for a long time it was just a real alive with rhododendrons, and they had these excursions that went out from Anacortes. They would take as many as 80 people out to there to pick the flowers and pick the plants, and this went on for some time. In 1907, some property owners over on Cypress put an ad, a notice in the Anacortes American that they didn't want people coming over there and picking these flowers anymore, you know, these off-islanders, so to speak. And it didn't really go anywhere because the Rhododendron Festival went on for some years. But back in, we wanted to rename it Rhododendron Island, but another person who comes up at this particular time back when the early 1900s is W.V. Wells. I know many of you knew Bill Wells, who was an attorney in town. His father, he went back generations, and his father, W.V. Wells, was the mayor of Anacortes, and they had a rhododendron day, and they had kind of a rhododendron festival, and so Cypress was part of that, where they would take these excursions out during this time. So that's getting a little ahead of myself, but just to say that there was it didn't go anywhere, but there was a small attempt by local people to call it Rhododendron Island because they thought it was more fitting because there were no cypresses there. So that's what W.V. Wells did, Mayor Wells. So we've got it named here. The first settler to move over there, I've got to get my glasses on now because I'm going to have to read some of my notes. The 1866 was the first settler, and his name was Humphrey Posey O'Brien. Now, Humphrey Posey O'Brien homesteaded. These are homesteaders in this time of the era. He homesteaded in Secret Harbor here. Apparently, right in this area here. And he didn't like it there. Didn't say why, there's no notes, but he didn't stay long, and I think it was just a couple of years. I guess he planted a big orchard, then had a lot of plants, then he moved to Guimas. So that's the connection between Cypress and Guimas. Humphrey Posey O'Brien, Humphrey P. O'Brien, was the first, he was not only the first settler homesteader on Cypress, but he was also the first white homesteader on Guimas Island. The other one was James Matthews, who was a Native American who somehow was able to get in on the Homesteading Act. Now these homesteaders, and I don't know, somebody who knows more about the Homesteading Act can help me here, but when you got a homesteading, you filed and you got a piece of land, and I don't think it cost much, but you had to prove up, which meant that I think over 3 to 5 years you had to be there and make improvements in order to get the title to the land. So the earlier Humphrey, starting with Humphrey Posey O'Brien, I'm going to read some of the homesteaders here, but he came in 1866, and he soon moved to Guimas. And then 1873 there was somebody called Earl Hammond. He went to Eagle Harbor, and 1882 Griswold bought, well, he sold to Shadrach Wooden in 1882, but in the 1880 census there were only 5 people on Cypress. The census, they had them way back then, believe it or not, so there were 5 people over there, and they're living in 3, they couldn't know whether there was 3 or 4 homes, and that, so anyway, those were the real early ones, and from 1880 to 1890, the population jumped from these 5 people, these Hammonds, Martins, and the Griswolds, to 29. So I don't know how, but there were more homesteaders that came. these homesteaders found Cypress very difficult. They thought they might be able to farm there, and there were only a few low places they could farm. One of them was Secret Harbor, and through over to the other side of Secret Harbor. Over here, this is all kind of lowlanded here. There was some farming that was attempted up here in the back of Pelican Beach, and then there was another small farm up in this Smuggler's Cove here. But mostly they were loggers and fishermen, and had orchards, and they grew things, and they probably didn't, need much income. They were probably living off the land the best they could. So I'm going to read some of the highlights here just in a chronological order, because this is kind of just put everything into perspective here. Most of these people that stayed from the 1866 to about 1900 were only there, the most was 14 years. 7 to 9 years, these in the 1880 census, the guy that had been there the longest eventually lasted 14 years, 7 years, and 7 years. And I read about a lot of these homesteaders who didn't last very long at all because they couldn't till the land. They would find something better somewhere else. So that was kind of it was always a challenge. It's always been very rugged over there. But let's see, these dates here, between 1876 and 1900, there were 44 homesteads that were attempted on Cypress, and only 19 proved up. That meant that, well, the percentage was less than half made it, I guess you'd say. So it was tough going. There were still some homesteaders, the ones that mostly were around the perimeter of the island, and down here. Well, this is where Humphrey O'Brien went, and then there was some Nedros here, and then there was somebody out here, and then there was somebody in Strawberry Bay, and up here. Those are the ones that kind of made more of a go of it, and so those that were living over there wanted a road, and they built a road in, let's see, what year do I have here? The county road, 1893 was the first road on Cypress. And these three property owners, one, this Nedro out here, and named Hilton, I think, or Milton, maybe it was Milton, whatever. He lived out here, he had a homestead here. They connected from here to here, and they went all the way up to Tide Point, right here. So there's no mark of it. They went along the backside and along here, and that was called the Perry Road in 1893. Let's see. Some of the other things that are kind of interesting here are just what did they do? How did they go to? Did they have schools? Well, in 1887, they had a Cypress school district which included Sinclair, and the school was actually located in Sinclair. In 1891, the Cypress only school district was established, but they had no school until 1892, when there was a schoolhouse built in at Reef Point down here on the corner, on the southwest corner. And the school days were only 3 to 5 months long, from May till June, May through June. And I had a little information here on one of my notes here, that the school teacher in 1887 named Agnes Peck had 18 students and was paid $40 a month for 3 months. So just kind of information about that. But, so they did have a school over there, but oftentimes they ended up going to Sinclair, and the one in 1892, they did send the students after the 3 to 5 months, they would send them to Sinclair. So they had a hard time, but at one time there was I'll get onto these names a little bit more. There was a fellow named Shadrach Wooten over there, who was one of the original homesteaders. Not the original homesteaders, he bought the lot from Griswold in there, but he and his wife had 12 children, And at one time, he was the superintendent of the school district, and all the kids in the school were his. So that's how small of a place Cypress was. So that was kind of funny to find out that he had all the kids in the school at one time, but that was just at one period. But the other things that are kind of like the basics here, like post offices, what they do to get their mail. Well, of course, they had mail boats that came. But the first one was in July 1st of 1880, and that was at Eagle Harbor, about the same place up there, where a fellow, let me see, I have his name here somewhere, but it may not matter. Anyway, he was going to have, he's the one that was the postmaster, and he had decided that he was going to he was starting a kind of a town there at Eagle Harbor. He was going to call it either Cypress or Eagle Harbor, but anyway, he had a post office there, and he was the postmaster. And it closed in 1882, and then reopened again and closed in 85, and then in 1887 they had to go to Sinclair for their mail on the south shore of Sinclair. And then August back in 1892, they abandoned it. But anyway, Nedro, finally in 1893 on the south shore of Cypress, he had his mail. The post office was down here, on here, and the mail boat landed on Tide Point because of the weather. And I was putting my finger in the wrong place, Tide Point over here. And they brought the mail down there to his post office. And he delivered it to, but that was discontinued in 1896. Then Cypress residents had to go to Guimas. So it was, they never had very good postal service over there, but they had some. Cypress was part of Whatcom County until 1883. These are just back and forth on some of my notes here. That the line for Whatcom County was actually drawn, it included originally, and I don't know who decided this, but the line for Whatcom County, when they decided to have Skagit County and Whatcom County, the line went that included Sinclair and Lummi, and went across, but then when they went to the legislature, they redrew it, well, maybe it was Vendovi, but anyway, they drew the line so that Vendovi and Sinclair are in the Skagit County. So they were started out in Whatcom County, but that was in 1883. In 1884, LaConner was the county seat then, when they did made Skagit County out of Whatcom County. And in 1884, it moved to Mount Vernon. Many people protested at the time, particularly from Cypress, because that was even farther to go, but so that was just kind of information about that. The next phase is after you go through the homesteaders and some of the, before 1900, they have what they call the second homesteading and retreat, and that's where you come up with some of these other names that I'm going to give you now. The first one is the Wootens. You've heard the name Wooten. Like Tom Wooten is the, I don't know what they call him. He's not the chief of the Samish tribe, but
Tribal chairman.
Tribal chairman. Okay. His family. There was two parts of the Wootens, and this is kind of an interesting thing. There was two brothers. They were from South Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina, Beaufort County. There was Shadrach and Richard. I'd never heard Shadrach before, but I think that's a great name. People searching for old names. Biblical name?
Shadrach and Abednego.
Yeah. So Shadrach and Richard from South Carolina came out for the gold rush in 1849. And I think they went to Canada, not Alaska, for 1849 for the gold rush. But on the way here to the northwest, they stopped over at the Samish. The Samish had their tribe over on Samish Island there, and I think that's where it was. And these brothers, Shadrach and Richard, each met these two Indian gals, and they met them there, and then they went on about their gold digging, and they came back later, and I don't know how many years later, but they married these gals, the two brothers. I don't think these girls were sisters, but they were from the same Samish tribe. And they settled in Anacortes. They homesteaded in Anacortes. And this is about 1880 or so that they settled in Anacortes and homesteaded, and they found there was some discrimination against their wives, their Indian wives. They weren't too accepted at the time, and so they decided to move on. Shadrach, in 1882, went to, and he bought from a fellow named Griswold at the time, the original place where Humphrey Posey O'Brien in Secret Harbor, Wooten bought that, Shadrach did. And he's the one that ended up having 12 children. Richard moved to Guimas, and he was the first Guimas white homesteader. The other homesteader before him was James Matthews, and I've talked to Wynn about this. It's down in Wynn's neck of the woods that the Matthews place was, and I really don't know where. Do you know, Wynn, where Humphrey O'Brien went? Where was his property? Humphrey O'Brien.
He was down in Dead Man Bay.
Same area in there. You're further on down a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Shadrach and Mary raised 12 children. And Shadrach died in 1912, and the Wootens, the last Wootens, lived on Cypress until 1924, and they moved on and finally sold out in 1938. But so that's a little connection with Guimas, and I was asking Wynn about it. I just didn't know the connection between the Wootens and the original Richard Wooten, who came over here. Did you ever find out any more? You said you were going to try to get a hold of Tom Wooten and find out some of that. Like,
no, I've got a list for him, so I'm
yeah,
going to have a face-to-face meeting.
All I remember is Maud and the boys, and these are grandchildren. They're down there now. So I don't know the connection, but it'll be interesting. Anyway, that was the connection with Guimas there. There's another family that the name LeMaster may be familiar with some of you. They have property next to Jimmy Morrison down there. Well, it's now Jerkovich is Ann's brother, Jerkovich family. His brother married a LeMaster. But the LeMasters at one time in 1920, I went to school with a Tim LeMaster, and his father was actually, in the 1920s, grew up on Cypress Island in Secret Harbor, and they moved there in 1920, so that's another little connection with Guimas. The other, couple other names I'll just mention, since I'm thinking of them right now. One of them, I see that Mac Lopp, I don't know how many of you remember Mac Lopp, but Mac Lopp was the first sand and gravel guy in Guimas. He was also a logger before that. He logged over in Mexican Bay in 1938 and 39, so just a little connection with Guimas there. Another little story, well, I've got it on this page, I'll just go along through with it, that this Shadrach Wooten had a son named Shadrach Wooten Jr. This is one of these stories of intrigue, that Sharky Wooten, as they called him, I like the name like Sharky. I guess he was a real, according to what I've read, real handsome fellow, and all the ladies liked him, and so he was back and forth between Guimas and Cypress, and he moved back there in 1920 because the LeMasters had moved on out from whatever their period of time was over there. And so he was building a 40-foot boat. Shadrach was apparently a really strong man. He also was quite a sailor. He was building a 40-foot boat, but it was said that he had rowed to Nia Bay in 2 days on a boat because he knew how to carry, with the tide to get out there. So you can imagine, though, he had to row too. But so the point was that when I read that part was that most everybody rowed around They rode to Guemas, they rode to LeConner, they rode to Sinclair, you know, that's what they did. I'm sure some of them might have had a sailboat or put up a sail, but, so anyway, this Sharkey, he had a girlfriend named Renee Isberto, was from Guemas Island, and she was over there at the farm in Secret Harbor. And he and she, well, first of all, Renee, she had either been estranged or divorced from her husband, and apparently, well, I'll get to the story here. She and Sharkey were going to Sinclair Island to pick strawberries or pick berries over there, and they left, and the next day they found the boat, this rowboat, that he had borrowed from a fellow named Charlie Hansen, a young boy named, 12 years old, had this dinghy. Anyway, they had rowed, they were going, and the next day they found her dead in the dinghy, and they never found him. So there was a lot of speculation. They suspected her husband, he was a Filipino, and they decided that, and there had been some Filipino people in the area, and they thought maybe, you know, he had done it. But he had an alibi that he was in Alaska, so they never prosecuted him, but some people suspected he might have had it done, but nobody knows. So that's a little intrigue. There's another one that comes later, but Sharkey's body was never found, and so they don't really know what happened, and nobody was ever pressed charges on that one. So that's the Wootens. I already mentioned that he was the superintendent and had the most kids in the school district over there at one time. Let's see, what have I got going here? There's people that have these interesting little snippets about their time on Cypress, and one of them was a guy named Dr. Henry Parks, who was a physician from Arizona, and he had had tuberculosis, and so he had a herd of goats that he kept in Arizona. It was like 200 goats, of these high-quality milking goats, and he believed that goat milk was a cure-all for whatever ailed you, but particularly TB. And so he met somebody somewhere, and they told him about Cypress Island. They thought that would be a perfect place for goats. And so he decided that he was going to come up and build we'll call it the Cypress Island Summer and Health Resort, in which he was going to cater to people with TB and just general health of drinking goat's milk. So he arrived with 200 goats at Pelican Beach, down here, Pelican Beach, let's see, Bridge Rock, right in this area right here, with 200 goats. There was some farmer up here named Olson, as I remember, that was somewhere in this land, and anyway, this Dr. Parks really wasn't prepared, and he couldn't keep his goats contained. I mean, talk about containing animals, I know, Tom. Me. But can you imagine 200 goats? Well, these goats started multiplying and everything, but he decided that he was going to move over to the other side of the island. He found some property over here by Tide Point, over in this area here, and I don't know exactly where. That's where he was going to build his resort. Well, he started building these little cabins and everything, but he never really got any business. But in the meantime, these goats were multiplying like rabbits, or like goats. And there were approximately 800 goats in a few years by the time and he then had to go about disposing of these goats, because they were eating everything up, and they were everywhere. So there were, 1924, they decided they were going to have the goat roundup. They kept failing. They just could not round up these goats, these 800 goats, and that was where this another person I'm going to mention here next is George Fahey, because George Fahey at the time was in high school. George Fahey is the one that owns Tide Point, and I'll do a little more history about him. But George Fahey came up in 1924 when he was in high school or college to help round up these goats. And he knew somebody over there, and they knew that it was one of those things where that's what familiarized him with Cypress Island. So in 1935, I'm just going to go ahead because I'll tell you about George Fahey. In 1930, I've got to get my days straight here. George Fahey, 1930, George Fahey, I've heard this a little more because I know his son Nick, who lives on Tide Point now, but his mother, when he was, I don't know whether he was 18 or 20 or something, he was in college, he was young, that he'd heard about this property that was going to go up for sale for back taxes at Tide Point. So his mother brought him up